Tu attends quelque chose, Michel?
Hein?
Tu attends quelque chose? Simplement dire ce que j'ai
Ah bon, c'est là-bas que ça va se passer?
Non, non, c'est ici, mais c'est la présentation d'abord officielle.
Et après, vous allez...
Après, on arrête pour une minute pour que les gens qui vont parler, que ce soit ici.
Bon, alors, d'accord,
oui.
on commence.
On commence.
Est-ce qu'on peut commencer? Can we begin?
If you please, we're continuing the session, please. S'il vous plaît, plus de discussion dans la salle parce qu'on continue, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that, without exception, the evaluation in either the Ukrainian press in the West, the British government's attitude and their reports, and the Menshevik and Social Democratic press in the West, have a very, very different evaluation of the size of the phenomenon of the famine than was discussed this morning or has been publicized in connection with the conference. We're talking about a difference of something like factor 20, going from 300,000 to 6 million. That's a fairly major discrepancy in sources, which raises certain problems in interpreting the period. That's it. So I'd like people to comment on that in general sense. The second question more specifically relates to the discussion we had in part this morning, and the analysis advanced concerning the Mensheviks in the presentation this afternoon. Professor, you mentioned that according to the Menshevik press, there was a social selectivity involved in terms of who was hit by the famine and who was not. Those on the bullets were provided with a minimum amount of food, undoubtedly inadequate, but a minimum amount of food, and that those who were not bullets were those who were left to starve. My specific question is, do you have the impression that that is a correct analysis of the situation? And if so, does that have something to do with the social question or the social policy being furthered by the regime during the period?
The various estimates that occur in the various sources must all without exception, be taken with great caution. Where they are based on first-hand impressions, and not all of these estimates are, but where they are based on first-hand impressions, they are usually arrived at, as in the case of William Henry Chamberlain, for example, by trying to count up the losses in a particular region, coming to the conclusion, say, that 10% in a particular village or in a particular region have died, and then trying to extrapolate from that total losses. Obviously, a very unsatisfactory way of arriving at any sort of an estimate. The estimates that I have seen range in one case from 1 million to 10 million, and in one case 15 million. Most of them, however, fall within the range of about 5 to 7 million. The British Foreign Office, on the whole, gives higher figures. William Henry Chamberlain, who toured Ukraine and the North Caucasus in October of 1933 and was a fairly knowledgeable observer, though not by any means a perfect observer, estimated a loss of 4 or 5 million in October of 33. Walter Duranty, who visited Ukraine and the North Caucasus shortly before Chamberlain in September of 1933, estimated 10 million. Otto Schiller, who of all the people providing estimates on the basis of first-hand observation, gave an estimate of 10 million. None of these estimates, however, can take the place of very minute analysis of all available statistical sources. They do not, any of them, provide an answer to the question of how many losses there were. In part, this is because entirely different phenomena were compared. In the records of the British Foreign Office, you will find that there is a reference in one document to a general agricultural crisis throughout the Soviet Union in one document. In another, there is a reference to famine in South Russia, whatever is meant by that. And in still another case, famine in Ukraine and the North Caucasus. So there is simply no way to compare any of these estimates, and we should not take any of them at face value.
6 to 7 millions. How it was arrived at? By examining the results of the Soviet censuses, yes? Now, the census immediately after the famine has been completely eliminated. Even some people who were taking it have been liquidated because it was sort of compromising for the government. I cannot give you the exact dates of the censuses when they were taken. Now, if you take the number of the population of Ukraine by the last census before the famine and compare it after the first census, which was published after the famine, if you include an estimated increase which was fairly stable in Eastern Europe in those days, so and so promille, you will find the population decreased by so much, by so many millions. And that was the basis of the figure of 6 or 7 millions. The fact is that the number of Ukrainians as such in the Soviet Union decreased instead of increasing during a period of 10 years or so, which was rather remarkable. Yes, now speaking of your question of the social, so many people who dislike the nationalities problem try to reduce everything within the Soviet Union to the social aspect. Now, if you do it this way, you will come to something, as my colleague, as Mr. Liebich here mentioned, irrational, unreasonable, something which you cannot understand. For no social reason, you would destroy 6 or 7 millions of your present or future working population. As you know, in the Stalin's Gulag camps, there were millions of so-called enemies of the people. None of them was destroyed outright. All of them were worked to death. Millions of them were worked to death. Now in Ukraine, they were destroyed outright, including children, future citizens of the Soviet Union. If you omit the national problem, you will come to something with purely and simply irrational. Economically speaking, now the great leader and teacher, Mr. Stalin, said, the greatest value for us is the man, the human. Now, that is economically speaking. As Marx said, the only real value in the society is the work of the worker. Now, these workers were lost, economically speaking. 7 million human beings, present and future workers, who would be creating values for the society, were outright destroyed. No economic, no social motive would justify such a measure. But same as Hitler destroyed the Jews without regard for the values from the social or economic point, Jews were rather valuable, economically speaking, for Germany too, for a very long time. So did the Stalin do with the Ukrainians too. The Ukrainians who fed the Russian Empire for centuries were destroyed because they were Ukrainians. They were an obstacle to the creation of the unified Russian, or so-called today, so-called Russian, Soviet state, Soviet Empire. Thank you.
The figures advanced by, you mentioned Zaradas in the 1930s. They don't they don't pretend to be scientific or systematic in the 1930s. As a curiosity, about 25 years later, when Abramovich is writing his history of the Soviet regime, there he uses the figure of 5 to 6 million. And I think he bases himself, if I'm not mistaken, on economic studies done by Naum Yasny, another Menshevik who in the 1950s was in the States. For the second question that you put to me specifically, sort of who suffered most? Was it the collective farmers or those who were excluded from the collective? If you remember, at an earlier point, the Mensheviks were writing that in fact people were fleeing the kolkhoz and going into the cities and looking for salvation there. And only later on do they say that it's the ones who are excluded from the kolkhoz who are suffering most. On the face of it, that seems to me to be quite convincing. I mean, one can see that those who have been excluded from the kolkhoz because they are considered class enemies or whatever would be those who would be particularly desperate and so would be the first to die. But of course, since this tallies so closely with the main point that the Mensheviks are making, that it's not collectivization which is an evil as such, one should perhaps look at it with some reserve, and I'd personally be happy to find confirmation or disapproval of this from statistical sources that someone else would advance.
Are there any other questions? In that case, je voudrais remercier les participants pour leur effort exceptionnel et intéressant. Merci.